let's talk about the 92 election, because I think people don't, it was a fascinating dynamic because Bill Clinton won without the majority of the votes, and not like an electoral thing. Like I'm saying, like
no.
He won with 45% of the vote, 43%, and they were talking about impeaching him, on November, whatever it was, 9th. Limbaugh in particular actually was talking about this. What did Republicanism learn from Perot in that instance? Because Ross Perot was this, I guess, I don't know if he was a billionaire, but he was just a super wealthy guy. I was unclear exactly like how he ever made his money. It was never really, he was just a really wealthy guy who was talking about, the biggest thing I remember was he was talking about NAFTA and the giant sucking sound. But what did they learn? What happened in that era?
Well, more than any specific policy, Perot represents an attack on the political establishment, a kind of vague populist notion that Washington was overrun by special interests, that a strong, hyper-competent leader needed to come in, a kind of technocrat, because he had a background in the technology industry and was a business tycoon, to come in and fix this. And he exposed enormous amount of anger, both with the Republicans and the Democrats, especially among white Americans, particularly conservative-leaning ones. And the Republicans made real efforts to win back the kinds of people who may have defected to the Perot movement. Newt Gingrich's message that he shaped for 1994, I don't talk very much about in my book because a lot of other wonderful books have been written about Gingrich, a lot of articles about, and I wanted to focus on other people. But he definitely, in his anti-establishmentarianism, was very influenced by Perot's success, and they wanted to make sure that constituency didn't slip by them again. So the Republicans, I think better than the Democrats, were able to look at the populist wave discontent of 1992 and to reincorporate it into their message, which is strange because, well, there's many reasons for this, but the party that had always presented itself against established wealth and power in the United States had always been the Democrats. The Republicans have managed a trick for the past 40 years where they can both be on the side of great wealth and portray themselves as anti-elitists and populists.
Well, it's voodoo economics on some level, right? It's
another way of thinking of it. Yeah, it's a incredible political trick that they've done, where they've convinced people that you can be a billionaire is more salt of the earth than a college professor.
But isn't part of that because at that point the Democrats had ceded that territory in some way, and so they had created a vacuum, in that era, because you had Jimmy Carter. Well, I mean, really, you start with the McGovern Commission in '72. Like, the reason why we have primaries now, as opposed, was in many respects to undercut the power of unions, for better or for worse. I mean, there were problems with the leadership of unions at that time. Starting in like '71, Carter is somewhat hostile to unions, and instead of like roaring back in the wake of Reaganism in support of unions, Bill Clinton really didn't have much to say about that. His populism was just going to McDonald's a lot at the time.
Bill Clinton had a very folksy affect, Southern gregarious politician. His actual instincts were quite elitist. He, was a Rhodes Scholar. He really loved being in the corridors of power, international summits, the special relationship with Britain. These are the sorts of things I think that he really lusted after as a young man, and he wanted to accomplish. His actual thinking on economics, as everyone knows, was quite right wing, quite influenced by Reaganism. He did not put much stock in the future of the trade union movement in the United States. During the campaign, he has to meet with striking Caterpillar workers who are very distrustful of where he's coming from. But he says, "Well, I'm against the company, hiring replacement workers." Organized labor continues its decline in the Clinton years, of course. But yes, I think that Clinton is not a populist. And
even though he snuck off to McDonald's. That was the big thing. There was always stories. It seemed like every couple of weeks, it was like Clinton snuck off the campaign trail to get a Big Mac.
Oh, I'm sure that that was not sent to the press whatsoever, right?
Yeah, well, I think they were. Yeah, they found many ways to make him seem very appealing, and he was very appealing to people. But in actual substance, a lot of his policies, especially when it started to get past 1994, really lean rightwards.
Well, I mean, I just want to talk about how much race was associated. But I mean, you go into stuff like Ruby Ridge and the sort of the increase, particularly during the Clinton years of the and I just remember, I was just saying before the show, I remember doing a joke about the increasing number of white supremacy groups during the Clinton years, and trying to sort of the premise of the joke was what makes you dissatisfied with the existing white supremacy groups that you got to start a new one. But but it seems to me that really what was going on there was that race, that we're still in the wake. There's a trajectory of how much race is playing a part in Republican politics from basically the Civil Rights Act and Medicare. And then sometimes it ebbs and it flows, but that this was an opportunity for it to sort of take its head out from the subterranean sort of levels and just pop its head up a little bit. Because so much of this is a proxy for those issues of race. And you had Clinton at that time sort of almost recognize it by having to sort of disavow, Jesse Jackson and do his Sister Souljah moment. He, is aware of this, while at the same time, going on Arsenio Hall and playing the saxophone and being the first black president. I think they were trying to float, but he was also saying but I'm not that kind of black president, an actual black president. I mean, that's almost sort of what was going on there.
He was very talented at being able to triangulate, as we now say. I mean, he oversaw the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, a mentally disabled black person, which
from the campaign trail.
From the campaign, he went back to oversee it. An execution that was strongly opposed by Jesse Jackson. This was a repudiation of Jackson, a deliberate one. He posed at Stone Mountain with Sam Nunn, and also with a bunch of black prisoners on a chain gang. He made it very clear that he was a good old boy in a lot of ways. But yes, he was able to go on Arsenio. He cultivated relationships with prominent black politicians, usually moderate ones, but some left-leaning ones. And yeah, he pulled this coalition together, which all politicians have to do. He can't be especially faulted for that. Certain maneuvers are legitimate, but he definitely, I would say, the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, the Stone Mountain stunt, I think executing somebody is quite a bit more than a dog whistle. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. And then he, has the temerity to tell people, well, if they try to pull another Willie Horton, I'm going to tell George H.W. where to shove it. And so I think the message he was hawking there was a little opportunistic. And yeah, in terms of racial politics, both things that George H.W. Bush was doing and saying, and things that Clinton were doing and saying, none of these were satisfying the extreme right. The extreme right grows. Ruby Ridge, as you mentioned, was a big part of this, but there are senses that the government is being taken over by one worlders. There's new world order coming. Both Bush and Clinton are representatives of this. And yeah, in the wake of Ruby Ridge, in the wake of Waco, the militia movement grows in the United States. Anti-government conspiratorialism grows in the United States. Timothy McVeigh, witnesses Waco, and this radicalizes him. He was already going down that path. But in some ways, those movements which kind of left electoral politics and sought more radical outlets have returned to electoral politics in the wake of Trump. But now Trump is the first politician in American history, and I think this is very important to note, to have united both these appeals to the mob and the street and electoral politics. And there's a word for that. So I think that's notable, is that
don't leave us hanging.
The word is fascism.
Yeah.
Which is a synthesis of electoralism and an activist politics that uses street violence. Trump is the first presidential candidate in a very long time to get the hearing and the enthusiasm of types of people who would not vote and thought the Republican Party was just as bad as the Democrat Party, as they would call it. And we're both controlled by the Jews or whoever else. And Trump is the first person that really excites that constituency. Now, he may be struggling with it more than he was a few years ago. But, when he appears on the scene, they say, this guy's speaking our language. This is the kind of thing that we've been waiting to hear. And they're very encouraged by it. And then you have, what was once called the alt-right, but that name is now quaint because there is no alternative. They are just the right.
Same with paleo conservatives too, right? Like that paleo conservative just came up as a way of distinguishing themselves from the neoconservatives.
Yeah,
I was at the RNC in 2004 on Radio Row and had some guy come up to me and go like, "I'm not with these other Republicans,
Right.
I'm a Pat Buchanan guy. The rest of these are Jews." And I was like, "Oh, I got some bad news to you." But that strand, and also like this, there was a I don't know if we interviewed Tesler or Sides, who had written a book together, but they cited some work that Michael Tesler did that always struck with me, that it wasn't until 2008, until after Barack Obama was elected, that 50% of non-college educated white people perceived that the Democratic Party was to the left of Republicans on race. Like it took that many generations, and you can see it. Like, nationally, the South goes Republican, but it takes a long time. You still got the Sam Nunns. I mean, there is a quality about like the sort of the populism that Buchananites espouse and the racism that is sort of like Dixiecratish.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in a way, my book is telling the story of the turning of the Southern strategy from a regional campaign to a national campaign. This rural urban divide, the racial divide. I mean, look, now you go into Maine and see the most union state in the country all the way up north, and you'll see Confederate flags.
Yeah.
And so these things are less to do with region anymore, although the South, is a very conservative part of the country that consistently elects the most right-wing, politicians. But these things are not constrained to any one part of the country. It's become a national issue. So I think my book is beginning to tell the story of how, yes, some of these things were once localized or was part of what you could call a Southern strategy, but then the Southern strategy goes national.
And it becomes sort of more of a psychographic rather than sort of a regional. So is there anybody who can replicate this in the Republican Party aside from Trump at this point? Or does it just, because, if you look at the actual sheer numbers of what's happening, they're becoming more and more. I mean, I think Trump has a very good chance of winning the election. But in terms of, part of that is electoral, and part of the reason why they hold the Senate is because of the design of the Senate. But in terms of like the further it just seems to me that there is this polarization is not going to benefit that cohort unless somebody can sort of always bridge that, massage that divide and peel some off, because largely they're just getting they're becoming sort of a rump on some level, but it takes a personality to sort of like cross that divide. Whereas like, we're looking at, I don't know, the polling in the swing states for Democratic senators, and they're all doing quite well because people don't like Republicans. It's just in this instance, Trump has a certain appeal and Biden has a certain, quality that people like. Maybe we should have our presidents like, a little bit younger or something to that effect.
Yes. I mean, it's a complicated series of questions, but essentially I do believe, does anybody in the Republican Party have the ability to replicate what Donald Trump does? Evidently not. I mean, all the primary challengers totally fizzled out. Trump is not primarily a phenomenon driven by policy preferences. He's a phenomenon driven by affect, imagination, myth, whatever you want to call it, a feeling. He combines the appeal of a third party candidate with a major party infrastructure. He is an entertainer. He knows show business. He has a very unique relationship to the crowd that no other American politician does, that he gets them going, and they like to be led by him, and they like the feeling of also giving feedback and guiding him. So he has very unique abilities, talents for an American politician. At the same time, although the only thing that excites a majority of Republican voters at this point, he has limitations. Certain parts of his appeal are frightening and disgust people and turn them off. So he's a mass phenomenon, but he cannot have yet to turn himself into a majority phenomenon in this country. Now, many political movements have managed to turn their countries into dictatorships or authoritarian or totalitarian systems, never really had to become mass, majority phenomenon. They had to be a big enough of a force to kind of crash through the gates of whatever constitutional system they had, and kind of take advantage of non-majoritarian parts of those systems in order to do that. You have to have enough of a critical mass, but not a majority. Now, I think what's concerning is that Trump may be doing the seemingly impossible, which is to combine this spiking of the white vote with a lot of racist messaging with an appeal that is actually expanding beyond white voters. And this is the kind of paradoxical and impossible things that happen in politics.
So I didn't mean to cut you off there, John, but I am just curious, please. Because we interviewed David Broder last week on what's happening in Europe and how the European Union parliamentary elections really spell bad things, I think, for some of these centrist, center-left, but really just centrist parties within Europe. How much do you attribute the lack of a real robust left or leftist representation in the Democratic Party to the ability for these kinds of coalitions to form, or these kinds of politics to feel more salient for people?
Well, I do believe in Europe especially, the radical right is the only, I mean, this may be changing slightly in France, is the only person, the only political voice that's giving a hearing to discontents about the way the economy has been arranged for the past 30 or 40 years. It's unfortunate that that's the case. They are not called, I think sometimes populist is the wrong word for it, but they're not called populist for nothing. There is a rejection there of economic elites that seem to have geared the economy in their favor, and doesn't seem to be a lot of hope for people who in the working and lower middle class. There's a similar thing going on in the United States. Unfortunately now, we've gone through a period, I think Biden has done some things that liberals, leftists, progressives were waiting for a very long time for a Democrat to do. Did not fully institutionalize all of them. I mean, certainly inflation has been a very big challenge to convince people that a more progressive economy would require a great deal of social spending. I mean, the argument is now easily made, well, we tried that and now we got rampant inflation, which is hurting our wages. The argument that many tried for a little bit, and I think somewhat shamefully, that there wasn't really such a thing as inflation, is no longer working. And it seems like inflation is getting under control. But yes, I mean, unfortunately, there was not a very loud voice. I mean, you have Bernie, you have Elizabeth Warren, to a certain extent, a loud voice in the United States that is speaking the language of economic populism from the left. That's also difficult to do as an incumbent, because you're basically saying we got to throw the rascals out and replace them with people who are going to help you out. Well, you've been in power for the past 4 years, at least on the level of the presidency. Running as a populist incumbent is a tough trick to pull.
I mean, it's also sort of like there's a weird disconnect. I mean, because for the moment, let's put Biden's foreign policy aside. Biden's series of policies, I think, were the most effective, or at least the biggest attempt I've seen from a Democratic president. Certainly more so than and certainly stronger on labor and antitrust and he was thwarted, and I think in part because of tactical or sort of maybe it's almost like the policies are one thing, but there's almost like a dispositional thing that makes you behave a certain way that communicates it as well as the policies. If he didn't feel like he had to invite Republicans in after the American Rescue Plan and had just gone in that, after March, when the Republicans are talking about Dr. Seuss in 2021, and he's just passed a $2 trillion bill, if he had come in that summer and said, here's my Build Back Better, instead of well, let's let the Republicans come in. Okay, that didn't work. Let's let Sinema and Portman come in. Meanwhile, that's when Manchin's on the phone with his donors going what am I supposed to do? Right. And it gives them time to array. If he hadn't done that, which was a dispositional thing, it wasn't just tactical. It was a sense that was broader. He undercut the momentum, it seems.
Well, I think this is a factor of Biden's age, not in the sense that he's senile or frail, but in the sense that his mentality is in a previous political era. And you see this both in his foreign and his domestic policy, is that his disposition towards Republicans, his speaking the language of bipartisanship, is definitely is appealing to some people, but is a different era. We live in a highly polarized era. I think that the Democrats that were likely to betray, maybe too strong a word, not be for their own political reasons, not be with the president's agenda. I think that's a factor of just the fact that the election was a closely run thing, and they were seeing that Republicans were still out there and mobilized, and they could suffer if they went too far to the left. But yeah, I think in his foreign policy as well, he looks at the Middle East and he sees Rabin, and not Ben Gvir and Belazil Smotrich, and I think that is unfortunate that that's his virtue in a certain way, and what we were hoping for was that he represented an earlier consensus of doing politics that was, more reasonable and gentler. Unfortunately, he's stuck in the thinking of that era, and those are no longer the cards we have to play. So, I think Biden's age shows itself there. I'm sorry to say it. I wish he was doing a better job. I don't want to sit here and criticize the Democratic incumbent, but it is remarkable that he is in a close. I mean, I think some of this you just have to give it to Trump and his particular talents and what he brings to the political arena. But it is remarkable to be neck and neck, essentially, against a man who tried to overthrow the government of the United States.
Convicted felon too, by the way.
And a convicted
John,
felon.
I'm not sure if you forgot about that part.
There's that too. But I just think that may show both. I think it shows two things. I think it shows the extreme headwinds, the unique confluence of forces in American politics, but it also frankly just shows that, I think a younger, more dynamic politician might be able to deal with these issues more smoothly, and we'd be having a different conversation right now. But and I don't think that Biden is fated to lose. I'm not a doomer in that sense. I think that Trump has significant problems to overcome, and Biden can win the election still. He is not buried. He's struggling. It's a fight. It's a competitive election. But I think that unfortunately, both domestically and internationally, he's a man of another era.
All right. We've held you for so long. I really appreciate your indulging. But let me one last question.
Of course.
Where in the event that Biden, and I have to say, like, if I had to bet, and I'd rather not, despite the motivated reasoning, I would bet that Biden's going to win. And a lot of it is just sheer demography. And, there's a polling out today that showed he's up still by 23 points with essentially young people, and they're just sheer numbers. There's more young people now in this electorate than there were in 2020 because of the size of the generations and COVID, frankly. But that's just the reality. So if he wins by even close to the same margins of young people, that we're talking maybe millions more votes, frankly. But putting that aside, assume that happens. Like, where does the Democratic Party go and where does the Republican Party go in broad strokes? I mean, this is a little bit outside your portfolio maybe, but I'm curious, do these trajectories maintain?
I don't know. I always really try to avoid making predictions, and this is why I'm a historian, because it's easy to talk about the past and it's very hard to talk about the future, and there's no quicker way to sound like an idiot than to make a prediction. I do think that this Republican Civil War that's being predicted for many years, in the wake of a Trump defeat that didn't really happen in 2020 because his defeat was so close and he was still so strong, and he really kept the hearts and minds of Republican voters, that may occur, and the Republican Party may go through some kind of purge and say MAGA is not the way forward. And obviously there's no other, as I were saying earlier, there's no other figure who can kind of replicate it, or I can't. It's very difficult to envision someone doing with the same set of skills. I don't know. I think the Republican Party will probably undergo a very tumultuous time, reinventing himself, and it will emerge as some synthesis of what it became under Donald Trump, and maybe a nod back to being a more conventional political party. Whether or not that's a successful national proposition, I don't know. They could very well lose on that, and they could win on that. The Democrats, it's hard to say. The leaders of the Democratic Party are quite old, and even the ones that are not seem quite conventional in a lot of ways. I mean, Hakeem Jeffries is a very middle of the road politician. I don't think that he has a bold vision for the future of the Democratic Party. I think he's interested in keeping donors happy. I think he's interested in keeping the coalition together so far as it exists. I don't think he is a visionary, and I think perhaps calling him a hack would be too far, but I mean, there's an argument to be made. And I think that, I don't know who represents the future of the Democratic Party. The politician who still has my heart, if not always, my mind, is Bernie Sanders. I think now he has more of my mind because he seems to be such a, constructive member of the coalition so far as it exists on the Hill. But his successors are under constant political attack, as you guys were talking about before I went on the air. So I think it's difficult to say where the Democratic Party goes. I think the struggle over whether or not it needs to tack to the left or the right is going to be ongoing. The future of how we think about foreign policy is going to be decided by this election, or at least many arguments will arise about how the election goes. So I don't know, but I do know that the struggles over these things will continue and intensify. Whoever loses the election will, have some kind of civil wars and purges.
Yeah, I wonder if the Republican Civil War hasn't already happened and we just didn't realize it. And,
it happened in 2016 and 2015 to a certain degree. Yeah.
I think so, right?
Well,
I mean, the Paul Ryans, like, Cantor, Paul Ryan, look at the young guns.
But maybe that's the optimistic take, is that the Sanders campaign was the Buchanan kind of trial run for maybe a future candidate who can win. I mean, perhaps, right? A lot of that rhetoric may be being echoed in the future.
We're really optimistic around here today.
Oh, I'm trying.
John, thank you so much. Really fascinating stuff. The book is When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. We'll put a link to that and your Substack, Unpopular Front, at majority.fm, and in the podcast and YouTube description. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.